Welcome back to the Band Guide, where we use GarageBand to create professional sounding music. I'm your band guy, Colin, and this is the 15th video in the Ultimate GarageBand Beginner's Guide. This video series is walking through everything you need to know from the very first time you open up GarageBand until you're exporting out your final mix and mastered song. In fact, throughout this series, we're actually recording, mixing, and mastering a song together, which is why I have a bass guitar, because today we are recording bass guitar together. So if you haven't already seen the other videos in the series, definitely go back and check it out. But before we even get into today's video, I want to give you something in addition to this series. I've actually put together the Ultimate GarageBand Guide. This is a guide that walks through gear you need, shortcuts, recording, mixing, mastering, how to record, how to mix, how to master in GarageBand. It's really going to help you out, and it's completely free from link in the description below. It's just a guide that you can reference anytime you're working on your music, so you don't have to find a video and find the right minute and all that stuff. You can just quickly pull up this guide, find the right section, and you'll be good to go. It's completely free from link in the description below, so be sure to pick it up. But let's go and get into today's video. We're talking about recording bass guitar. Now, one final note before we get into it, addressing the elephant, or rather alien and monster in the room. I lent my bass the other week to a buddy of mine who had some shows coming up that he needed it for, and so my other buddy Benji allowed me to borrow his bass, which is not quite my aesthetic, but it will do the trick. It still can sound great, and it's a great example of how even with a beginner Squire bass, you can get a great sound with bass as long as you're following the principles that we're talking about in this video. Now, there's 3 principles that we're going to go through in order to get a great bass recording, a great bass sound in our song. The first is that we're recording at the right volume. This is really important, and there's a couple nuances to it that you need to understand. The second is getting a great tone, and again, there's a few little subtleties here that are important. And then finally, getting a great bass recording. And of course, there's a few little subtleties to this that are important as well. So we're going to cover all that as quickly as we can in today's video. And let's go ahead and get into it, starting with how to record at the right volume. Okay, so we're in GarageBand here, and the first thing we need to do to be able to record our bass in GarageBand is obviously create a track to record it on. Now, this is a real source from the real world, meaning we need to record it through an audio track. We're recording audio from this source into the computer. Now, you could do the guitar track. My preference is actually to just use the microphone or line input track and add a bass amp to it. It's just a cleaner setup, in my opinion. So we're going to start with that, default to that. And we're going to close our library over here. Now, at the bottom, you'll see it opens a smart control window. You can also open and close it right here or with B on the keyboard. And this is important because this bottom left corner here is where you'll see your recording settings, which has to do with how you're actually connecting your bass to your computer. So if you haven't seen my video on gear you need to record, definitely go check that out. I'll link to that above here. You need an interface to be able to record something from the real world into your computer. And so with an interface, I can just take my regular 1/4 inch out like I would with a regular cable into my bass amp, guitar amp, and plug it directly into that, and then that will convert the signal into something that my computer recognizes. Now, from here, you need to make sure that the input is the same as the one you plugged into. So here I have this plugged in input 1, so I'm seeing that there. And I need to make sure that this only has one single circle. That just means it's only coming from one input. We only have one output from our bass guitar, so we only need one input going into the recording. And then finally, you want to turn on input monitoring. This is how you'll actually hear the bass coming into GarageBand. So input monitoring there. You can also see it's up here. If you're not seeing it there, you can right click on this track and hit configure track header. And you can enable that button right there to be able to see it and turn it on and off right here. So we want to make sure that's on. And then if all that's good, you can collapse this section down. And now we're getting into the really important section, which is our plugins here. So plugins are just processing or tools built into GarageBand to help us record and mix. And we talked about in a video the other day about having some plugins that you can download that are free that help fill some gaps in GarageBand. So the tool that we're going to be using here is what's called MV Meter 2. This is a meter plugin that allows us to see very accurately how loud we're recording in GarageBand, which is really important. Unfortunately, GarageBand doesn't give us a super accurate way to see how loud we're actually recording, and this makes it much, much easier to set your recording levels. So when you first pull this up, it's going to default to something called VU. We're going to use that in a second, but we first want to change our preset here to peak standard. This is going to be checking the actual peak. Now, it's really important that we get our recording volume right, because if we record too loud, at a volume that's too loud, the signal's going to come into the computer. The computer doesn't know what to do with it at some point, and it just cuts it off, right? We lose that part of the audio, and there's no way to get it back because the computer just didn't record it. It didn't know what to do with it. So recording below that peak volume, which is what this meter is going to help us do, is really, really important. So the first thing we're going to do is on this peak peak meter, just make sure that we are below 0. Typically, I'm looking somewhere between -10 and -6. I'm okay if it goes a little bit past -6, but somewhere between -10 and -6. So I can see here under max that I'm way below that. So I'm going to turn up my input on my interface here. And we can hear it's louder, but we can see I still have a little bit more to play with. Let's see. You want to play as hard as you think you could possibly play in your song. So we'll play around with that just a little bit more. Bring up the volume just a little bit more. Okay. That's looking pretty good. Now, that is just protecting us from not peaking, right? By the way, to reset this, after you've hit your loudest point, you can click on it, and that's going to reset it back to the max. Okay, so we're seeing -4.3. We're solid here. So we're now protected against the peak, but let's talk about getting kind of that ideal volume. So as I mentioned, this will default to something called your VU meter. Now, the VU meter is looking at an average volume over about 300 milliseconds, and 0 here is not calibrated to be peak, it's calibrated to -18. And so 0 is actually becomes the goal on a VU meter. Now, by the way, I just switched between presets here. I know some people have had trouble with presets in this plugin. If you're not seeing them up here, then you can click on these 3 lines here and go down to factory, and you'll see all those same presets there. Or if you actually click on this word, you can see the presets down here as well. So once we've set your peak, then you want to look at your VU. And what you're looking for here is actually that you're hovering around 0. It's okay to be a little bit above and a little bit below because it's an average, and 0 here is actually -18. So this is, we're looking like we're in a pretty good level here, where occasionally we'll go over, but generally speaking, it's just below, right in that safe range on a VU meter. So now we've set our right volume, it's time to move on to part 2, where we're getting the right tone. So when it comes to tone, there's actually 2 elements you need to be thinking about. The first is the obvious one, which is the amp. The second is kind of how you're playing on the neck, which we'll talk about in just a second. First, let me just pull up an amp here. So under your plugins, you can add an amp, and it's my recommendation that you put this amp as the very first thing in your plugin chain. If you want to add a pedal board, you can add it before that. Think of it like the real world. If I were to plug this bass in the real world and record it, I would be plugging this bass into an amp in the real world, bass into the amp, and then I would put a mic on that amp. So I want that amp to be the first thing in this plugin chain. These plugins go from top to bottom. So you can see here, we have a really, really cool amp. If you've already seen my video on the GarageBand Amp Designer, you know mostly what's in this, but there's a little bit more with this bass amp designer that we'll look at in just a second. So this is the bass amp, and we're gonna work on getting that tone in just a second. But before we even get to that tone, you need to be thinking about how you're actually playing these notes. Because with bass, there's a lot of variability that you may not have picked up on just in a live performance way if you've been practicing, even if you're really good at bass, or if you're not a bassist and you're just recording bass for the first time. Something that's really crazy to know is how different notes can sound depending on where you're playing them on the neck. So if I hit a D on my A string, so 5th fret on my A string, we hear a decent full tone. If I hit a D on just the D string here, it's quite a bit thinner sounding, right? A little bit out of tune there, but you get the difference between the tone, right? Same thing with this A on the low E string versus the A itself. Pretty big difference in tone between these different notes depending on where you're playing them on the neck. So as you're thinking about the tone in your song, you might need to spend a little bit of time just playing around and figuring out where you get the most consistent low end and tone from your bass, because it might be easiest to go up to this D, but if it's not going to sound as good, you might actually want to play that D right here. Especially like in this song, we're going to go back and forth between an A and a D, and I want those to be really consistent between the two. And if I were to go to between this A and this D, that's a lot thinner than a big difference compared to if I go between this A and this D. right? So you got to be thinking about these things as you're figuring out how you're going to play your part in your song, and listen to it in the recording context is the first time that you may actually notice some of these things. So even if you've been playing bass for a while, you might have to play around with it a little bit more, thinking about it in the context of your recording. Okay, that's the first area that you need to be thinking about tone. The second area is in the amp itself, and there's a wide variation of tone you can get here. I'm not going to break this down in depth. I've done the video on the amp designer. I'll link to that above here. If you haven't already seen that, check it out. It doesn't go into the bass amp designer, but it's the same general flow. A big difference that you get with this amp designer is that you also have a DI over here, a direct box that you can blend into the signal. So a lot of bass recording in the real world, the way you might approach it is to record a direct signal from the bass and an amp, and you blend those two signals together. You'd have to have two different tracks and get all their tone right. Here you can literally have it just on one, and I can blend between the amp over here on the left, DI box only here on the right, and anywhere in between. So we can get all of our tone here on just one track. That's really cool. Okay, so I'm just going to record a little snippet of the bass part so that I can easily flip between the tone while we have that looping. Before we do even that though, I want to take a quick break and name this track. I'm a big advocate for naming your tracks and keeping your sessions really organized. So we're just going to turn on a metronome here, and we're just going to record a little bit. Cool. Okay. So now I'm just going to loop that. Just a really basic progression. And we're just going to solo that here. Not the best performance in the world, but it will do the trick for our purposes here. So now we can go through and play around with these settings and find what we really like. So let's start by dialing in the direct box. Right off the bat, I can see it's adding a lot of volume. So I'm going to bring the volume down here. Still adding quite a bit. Turn the output volume down just a little bit. Okay, so the DI signal is going to be where we get kind of the low end and warmth from our signal from, and then I'm going to use the amp over here to dial in a little bit of grit on top of that. So I want this to be fairly low endy. The tones vary over here from kind of subbiest to brightest and thinnest. So in this case, I'm just going to go with the number 1 that has the best low end. That's distorting there, obviously. We'll keep the bass, the boost roughly where it is. All right, let's go back to just the amp signal. And now let's flip through some of these amps. So if I change over here, we can actually see them both change at once. Very different sound. Kind of like that. Some of the mid-range of that I like. Let me try driving up a little bit of grit. A little more mid-range. A little bit of compression. Turn the master down just a little bit. Turn this down over here as well. All right, let's play with these amps just a little bit more. I'm liking this actually pretty well right now. Cool. I like what that EQ's doing. All right, now let's blend in the amp in the direct box. Somewhere around half sounds pretty good to me. It's all direct box, it's all amp. That feels pretty good, pretty balanced to me. Okay, so I like that tone pretty well. The last thing you need to do is check your MV Meter 2 plugin after the bass amp. So when I put on this bass amp, I put the MV Meter 2 after it. Now I want to open this and I want to make sure that we're at a good volume with this amp, because you have your recorded volume, which is how loud it is right here, which, by the way, if this is really, really small, that means you're recording too quiet. If it's like huge, that means you're recording too loud. So this is roughly where you want this to be visually. Now, this recorded volume is not impacted by this amp, but I also don't want this amp to be adding volume and making this distort. So for example, if I turn the output over here, this volume way up, we start to get some distortion, some digital distortion, some peaking, clipping. we don't want that. We want to make sure that this is set at a really solid level. So let's look on this meter here, and let's change it over to peak, because first and foremost, we just need to make sure we're not peaking. So we're going to save volume there. Let's actually turn it up just a little bit. That's solid. Let's look at our VU. Hovering right around 0. A little bit over sometimes, but again, 0 on VU is -18, so we're solid there. So that's it. Now we figured out our tone. Now it's time to start recording our bass part. So getting a great recording boils down to 3 main things, right? We've talked about this before. We want to make sure that we have the right tone, which we've already talked about and got dialed in, but we also need to think about while we're recording in terms of how we play it. So the right tone. We want to make sure that we are really locked into our timing so that we're locked in with everything else in the song. We don't want to be loose and sloppy in our timing. And third, we want to make sure that we get the right take. So tone, timing, take. And with take, there's 2 things that are really, really key. The first is that we're in tune. If we're not in tune, it's not going to be a good recording. It's not the right take. So we need to check our tuning regularly. So the built-in GarageBand tuner is invaluable here. We can just quickly reference that in between takes so we always know that we're in tune. So that's really, really helpful. And then we also need to be really, really consistent. A good bass part is really, really consistent. You don't want to have some notes that are really super powerful low end and then the next note is like really, really weak and soft. You want to make sure that it's as consistent as you can get it to be. So being really, really dialed in on consistency is a big part of your bass recording. So let's start by just checking our tuning really quick. Now I'll probably mostly be playing on my A string, but I want to go and tune all my strings just to be safe. Cool. Okay. So now that we've tuned up, let's go ahead and just record a little bit. And I'm going to focus as much as I can on my timing. Last thing I'll say here is that I always put my metronome on, even if I have a drum track. That way I can be counted in. And I also, if I have any sort of pauses anywhere, I just know that there's always going to be a metronome. I also like having that accent right on the beat. It's helpful to me. Okay, let's go ahead and record. Messed that up, right? Okay, so not necessarily a perfect performance by any means. There's a couple of things I would go in there and edit and tighten up. But first and foremost, let's just get this ending right. So at the end, I went to a wrong note right there. Let's just punch in. So this is called a punch in, and you can do this at the end of a section or in the middle of a section. And this is the way that I'll tighten up my recording. So I'll just go towards about halfway into this chorus and I'll start recording, and I'll just come in when I'm ready before the part that I want to actually punch in. Did it again. So that actual transition I think was fine. So I just need to punch in on those last couple of notes. So we'll just start here. A little bit of a ring at the end. So I want to tighten that up. You hear how the bass just rings right there in the last note. We want to avoid that, so we're going to just punch in one more time around that same area. Cool. Maybe that should sustain though. No, I like it being a hard stop. Da 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 da. Yeah, I think so. Okay, so now with these punch-ins, what I can do is just bring this back up until they line up and we don't notice that transition. Let's listen to that with the drums. Cool. Okay, so I should mention I'm not a bassist. I played bass on a lot of songs, but I'm primarily a drummer. Okay, so there are a couple little things in there that I'm noticing that I'm not loving. Just small, slight timing things. So there's a couple ways that you can edit timing, and this is something that I do while I'm recording bass. I want to record like I can't edit, but I do want to make sure that I have everything I need before I'm done recording, right? So if I have a 95% good part where it's very consistent, but the timing's just a little bit off, then I might edit the timing just a little bit. Let's listen to this here. So I think the timing's a little bit tighter on this one. So I'll pull this back here. Let's listen to that. A little bit of a weird transition. A bit of a weird transition. Okay, so one of the coolest things built into GarageBand is something called flex time. So if I hit E to bring up my editor window here, I can click on flex time here, and it's going to give me these little points where I can actually adjust my timing just a little bit within a section. So we'll see here. I get just a little bit ahead on a couple of these beats right here. And so if I just pull this back just a hair, just get those beats right where they should be, I'm good with that, right? So it's very, very subtle edits, but it fixes the problem for me, right? It gets it tightened up just enough. Cool. Okay, so that is recording bass. Use punch-ins to come in if you know you just mess up at one little area. You can use a little bit of flex time to just tighten up a little bit of sections. You can also use something called destructive editing, which is, if I close this here, let's say this note was just a little bit off from where I want it to be, or this one, since it's just an isolated note, I could trim this note on either side of it and shift this one note just a little bit to put it where I want it to be. I actually did that note pretty on, so I'm going to leave it. But you can mix those little bits of editing in while you're recording and make sure that you get a fully tight performance that you're proud of, that's in time, in tune, which is really important, consistent, and it does the actual part that you want it to do. So as long as you get your recording volume right, you get the tone you want, and you get the take that you want, you're going to have a great bass recording that you're proud of and that you're happy with. That's a good foundation to now start layering guitars and vocals and all that stuff around. Okay, before we go, be sure to grab the Ultimate GarageBand Guide from the link in the description below. Walks through recording, mixing, mastering, gear you need, all that good stuff. It's completely free from the link in the description below, so be sure to grab it. And as always, I'd love to hear from you. How have you approached recording bass guitar in the past? Let me know in the comments below. If this video is helpful, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you tomorrow with another video where we're adding guitars to this.
One thing at a time, I can